There are things hanging in my father's smokehouse that I was never supposed to see. He kept that door padlocked for 31 years, and all that time I never once asked him why. You don't ask a man like Walt Mercer about his locks. You learn to read the weather in his face instead, and that morning, the day they buried him, the weather said nothing at all. My name is Della Mercer, and 3 weeks before I drove back to the Hollow, I had lost everything that the world counts. The house in Knoxville went first, after the restaurant folded and the second mortgage came due. Then the car, sold for less than I owed on it. Then the marriage, which had been hollowing out for years, and finally just caved in like a roof under wet snow. I was 44 years old, and I had a duffel bag and $600, and a phone that would shut off at the end of the month. When the lawyer called to say my father had died alone on the porch of the farm, I swore I'd never go back to. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because there was nowhere left to fall, and the ground had come up to meet me anyway. The farm sits at the dead end of Cutshin Road, up in Leslie County, Kentucky, where the mountains close in so tight the sun doesn't clear the ridge until almost 10 in the morning. 81 acres of the steepest, rockiest, most stubborn dirt God ever made, and my father had worked every foot of it with his hands until the day his heart quit. The county people, the ones who came up from town, they always said the same thing about our place. Pretty to look at, worthless to own. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. They were wrong about it being worthless, but it would take me a long time and a great deal of grief to understand exactly how wrong. I want to tell you about my father first, because everything that came after only makes sense if you understand the man. Walt Mercer was born in that hollow in a 4-room house his own father built, and he died maybe 200 feet from where he was born. In between, he left exactly twice. Once to bury his wife, my mother, when I was 9. Once to drive me to the bus station when I was 18 and couldn't get out of those mountains fast enough. He didn't argue with me about leaving. He just stood by the truck with his hat in his hands. This big, quiet man with forearms like fence posts. And he said, "The land will be here when you need it, Della." I told him I'd never need it. I was wrong about that, too. He raised hogs, mostly. A few cattle when the price was right. A garden that fed us through the winters, and hogs. People in the hollow brought in their animals to slaughter and cure, because nobody could touch what Walt Mercer did with a side of pork. He had a smokehouse he'd built himself the year I was born, a squat little building of chestnut logs and river stones set back against the hill behind the barn, and the things that came out of that smokehouse were known across 3 counties. Hams that hung for 2 years and came out the color mahogany. Bacon that made grown men go quiet. He'd learned it from his father, and his father had learned it from his, and the whole chain of it went back further than anybody could say, back before there were paved roads in Leslie County, back before there was much of anything but the Mercers and the mountains and the long, slow work of staying alive. I should tell you what that work was like, because I think people who've never done it imagine farming as something gentle. It is not gentle. My earliest memories are of cold. We killed hogs in November, when the weather turned hard enough to keep the meat from spoiling, and a hog killing started before light and ran past dark, and a girl of 8 was not too young to help. I carried water. I tended the fire under the scalding barrel. I learned the smell of it, the particular smell of a working farm in killing season, wood smoke and blood, and the sweetness of the meat and the lye soap my father scrubbed with afterward until his hands cracked. He never complained about the cold or the work or the way it never let up, not once in my whole childhood. He'd just look at the sky and say what the weather was going to do, and he was never wrong, and he'd keep working. I used to think it was because he had no feelings. I understand now it was the opposite. He felt everything and had decided, somewhere back before I was born, that feeling things out loud was a luxury a man in these mountains couldn't afford. He talked to me through the work instead. That was the only way he knew. He'd show me how to read a ham, how to press your thumb against it, and feel whether the cure had taken all the way through. He'd show me which would burn clean and which threw a bitter smoke, hickory for the body of it, and a little applewood near the end for sweetness. Never pine, never greenwood, never anything that hadn't seasoned a full year. He'd show me how to bank a fire so it would smolder low and steady through the night without flaring, and he'd say, "Low and slow, Della, that's the whole secret of everything worth doing." You can't rush a thing that's meant to take years. I heard him say that 100 times, and I never once thought it was about anything but meat. He was a patient man teaching an impatient girl, and the lessons went into me the way water goes into dry ground, slow, and you don't see it sink in, and then years later something grows there that you didn't know was planted. The hollow respected him in a way I didn't appreciate until I was grown. He wasn't a talker, and he wasn't a churchgoer past the once a month my mother had made him promise. And he had no use of the men down at the store who spent their mornings spitting and complaining. But when a family lost their breadwinner, it was Walt Mercer who showed up before dawn to get their fall hogs killed and cured, so the children would have meat through the winter, and he never took a dollar for it, and he never let anyone say a word about it afterward. When the Hensley boy got hurt in the mine and couldn't work his place, my father worked it for him for 2 seasons, his own farm and the Hensleys both, and aged 10 years doing it. People knew. In the hollow, that kind of knowing is the only currency that matters. He was the richest man on Cutshin Road, and he never had $200 in the bank at one time in his life. And I was too young and too hungry to leave to understand that those two things were not a contradiction. But here's the thing I never understood as a child. There were 2 smokehouses. The one everybody knew, the working one, sat close to the barn where it was handy. That's where the hams hung, where the hickory and apple would smolder in the cold months, where I spent so many freezing mornings as a girl feeding the fire and hating every minute of it. But there was another building, smaller, older, set further up the hill in a stand of cedar where the ground leveled off into a little bench of flat land. My father called it the old smokehouse. It had a heavy door and a hasp and a padlock, brass gone green with age, and in 44 years of life I never once saw that door open. When I was small, I asked about it. I must have been 6 or 7. We were walking the fence line, and I pointed up the hill at that little stone building half hidden in the cedars, and I asked him what was inside. My father stopped walking. He looked at it for a long moment, and something passed over his face that I had no name for then, but that I recognize now, having worn it myself. It was the look of a man standing at the edge of something he decided long ago not to talk about. "That's your grandfather's smokehouse," he said, "and your great-grandfather's before him." "What's in it?" I asked. "Things that aren't ready yet," he said, and he started walking again, and I knew the conversation was over the way you know when a door closes in another room. I asked a few more times over the years. The answer was always some version of the same. Not ready. When it's time, you'll know someday. By the time I was a teenager, I decided it was nothing, an old man superstition, an empty building he kept locked out of habit the way he did everything out of habit. I told myself that for 26 years. It was easier than wondering. The lawyer's name was Pruitt, Harlan Pruitt, and he had an office above the hardware store in Hyden with a window unit that rattled and a desk piled with the affairs of dead mountain people. He was older than my father, which made him very old indeed, and he had hands that shook slightly when he poured the coffee, but his eyes were sharp and they didn't miss anything. And when I sat down across from him, he looked at me for a good while before he said a word. "You favor your mother," he said finally, "around the eyes." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "Your daddy and I went to school together," he said, "first through 8th, in the old building down at Stinnett before they consolidated. He was the smartest boy in that school and the most stubborn, and I'll tell you, Della, those 2 things together made him a hard man to help." He paused. "But he came to me 3 years ago, and he had me draw up his will, and he was particular about it, more particular than any client I've had in 50 years of practice. He had me read it back to him 4 times. He slid a folder across the desk. "It's simple enough on its face," he said. "The land, the house, the equipment, the livestock, all of it comes to you. You're the only child. There's no one can test it. No debt against the property. He owned it free and clear, which is rarer than you'd think up here." He paused again, and now those sharp old eyes settled on me. "But there's a condition, and it's the strangest condition I have ever written into a will, and your father was immovable on it." "What condition?" I said. "You're not to open the old smokehouse," he said, "until you have lived on the property for 1 full year, not a day less." And he wrote out that if you sell the land or sign it over or borrow against it before that year is up, you forfeit the entire inheritance, and it goes to the church down at the mouth of the hollow. He pulled a single sheet from the folder. He wrote you a letter to go with it. I'm to give it to you only after you've heard the terms. Those were his instructions. The envelope was the kind you'd buy at a dollar store, and my name was on it in my father's handwriting, that cramped, careful print of a man who'd left school after the 8th grade and never stopped being a little ashamed of his letters. My hands were not steady when I opened it. Della, it said, if you are reading this, I am gone, and I am sorry for all the years we lost, most of which were my fault, though your mother always said stubbornness is a sin that runs in both directions. I know you are likely in a hard place, or you would not have come back. The land knows how to hold a person up when nothing else will. Live on it a year. Work if you can, rest on it if you cannot, but stay. At the end of the year, open the old house on the hill. The key is where you'll think to look once you've been here long enough to remember who you are. I could not give you what's in that smokehouse before now, because you would not have understood it. And a thing given before its time is wasted. Trust me one more time, the last time I will ever ask. Your loving father, Walt. I read it 3 times in Pruitt's office, and then I folded it back into its cheap envelope. And I asked the only thing that mattered to me right then, which tells you everything about the state I was in. If I open it before the year is up, I said, I lose the farm. Every acre, Pruitt said. He was watching me carefully. Della, I'll tell you what I told him. I said, Walt, this is a peculiar thing to do to a grieving child. And do you know what he said to me? What? He said, Harlan, the peculiar thing would be to hand her a fortune she's not ready to carry. He said that exact word. Fortune. I asked him what he meant, and he just smiled at me and said, you'll find out when she does. Pruitt leaned back. I have wondered about it every day since. I am an old man, and I do not expect to live long enough to see that door opened. So you'll have to satisfy my curiosity another way. By living up there a year and finding out, I drove out to the farm that same afternoon. I want to be honest about what those first weeks were like, because the people who tell these stories sometimes skip the part where you almost don't make it. The house was cold, and it smelled of my father, of his pipe and his coffee and the liniment he rubbed into his shoulders, and every room of it was an ambush. His coat still hung by the door. His reading glasses sat folded on the Bible on the kitchen table, marking a page in Ecclesiastes. There was a hog in the lower lot that didn't know its keeper was dead and stood the fence every evening waiting to be fed. And the first time I carried the slop bucket down there, I sat on the cold ground and cried until I couldn't see. I had no money to speak of. The $600 went fast, on propane and feed, and the kind of groceries that keep. The phone died at the end of the month like I knew it would, and I didn't have the money to turn it back on. So for a while I was as cut off from the world as my father had ever been. I learned to split with, again, the muscle memory coming back to my hands after 26 years. I learned which of the old skills I'd hated as a girl had stayed in me and which I'd have to relearn from scratch. I kept the one hog alive, and then, because keeping alive gave me a reason to get up, I traded a neighbor 2 days of help with his tobacco for a sow and a litter of shoats. And just like that, I was a hog farmer, the thing I'd spent my whole life swearing I would never be. And every single day, the old smokehouse sat up there on the hill in the cedars, locked, waiting. I won't pretend I didn't think about it. There were nights, the bad nights, when I'd stand at the kitchen window looking up at that little stone building, and the thought would come slow and poisonous. Whatever's in there, you could sell it. You could sell all of it. The land's worth something to somebody. And whatever your father hid up there, an old man doesn't lock a thing away for 30 years if it's worthless. You could be done with this. You could be warm. The condition felt like cruelty on those nights. My father reaching out from the grave to make me suffer through a year of cold and want before he'd let me have whatever was mine. I came close more than once to calling Pruitt and telling him I'd take my chances, open the door, sell the lot, and walk away. What stopped me was small and stupid, and it saved my life. I think it was the hogs. You can't sell a farm out from under livestock you've come to know. And by then I knew them. The sow I'd named Ada after my mother, the shoats with their particular personalities, the way they ran to the fence when they heard my boots. A thing that depends on you will keep you alive longer than your own will to live ever could. My father knew that. I understand now that the whole condition, the whole brutal year of it, was built on that single piece of mountain wisdom. He wasn't making me suffer. He was giving me something to keep me here long enough to heal. The man who tried to take it from me was named Coy Ribel. He came up the road in October, in a truck too clean for the hollow, the first vehicle I'd seen in weeks. He was maybe 50, soft in the way of men who've never done a hard day's work, with a golf shirt and a gold watch and a smile that he turned on like a faucet. He had a folder under his arm. I knew his type before he was out of the truck. The landmen come around the mountains like crows after a hard rain, and they can smell a fresh grave from 40 miles off. "You be Walt's daughter," he said, climbing the porch steps without being asked. "Coy Ribel. I'm with Cumberland Ridge Resources." He stuck out his hand. I let it hang there until he took it back. "I was real sorry to hear about your daddy. Fine man, fine man. You know my father," I said. The smile flickered and came back. "Well, his reputation. Anyhow, look, Miss Mercer, I'll get right to it. I respect a person's time." He opened the folder on the porch rail. "Cumberland Ridge has been putting together acreage all up and down this watershed. We're a land management outfit, conservation-minded, real careful stewards. And your daddy's place here, well, it backs right up against the track we already hold." He laid a check on top of the folder. Face up, the way they do, so the number hits you before the words can. It was a number with a lot of zeros. More money than I had ever held in my life. "We'd take it as is," he said. "Hogs and all. You wouldn't have to lift another finger. Sign today, and I can have funds to you inside of 2 weeks. Clean break. Fresh start." He looked at me, kind as a snake. And forgive me for saying so, but it looks like you could use a fresh start. I looked at that check for a long time. I want you to understand that. I didn't recoil from it. I stood there on my dead father's porch with frost on the boards and a hole where my whole life used to be, and I looked at enough money to make all of it stop. And I wanted it. God help me. I wanted it so bad my teeth ached. But I'd read the will, and I knew that if I signed before the year was up, I'd forfeit everything anyway. And Ribel would have bought a farm I had no legal right to sell, which many either didn't know about the condition, or he was hoping I didn't. "There's a smokehouse up the hill," I said. "You see it from here?" He followed my eyes up to the cedars. "The old stone one?" "Sure. You want that too," I said. "In the as-is." "The whole property," he said, smooth, but something had moved behind his eyes, quick, like a fish under ice. "Every building. Like I said, as-is." That was when I knew. A man who's been putting together acreage all up and down a watershed. A man careful enough to know my father's reputation. That man knew about the locked smokehouse. Everybody in 3 counties knew about the locked Mercer Smokehouse. It was practically a legend. And he'd walked up onto my porch and made me an offer and never once mentioned the one thing on the property that the whole region wondered about, which is exactly what a man does when he's pretending not to want the thing he wants most. "I'm not selling," I said. The faucet smile shut off. "Miss Mercer, that number is good through Friday. After that, the offer comes down. That's just how it works. The longer a distressed property sits. And forgive me, but this is a distressed property, and you are a distressed owner." He gathered his folder. "You think on it. You think real hard on what it's like up here come January." He went down the steps, and at the bottom he turned. "Your daddy was stubborn too," he said. "Stubbornness don't keep you warm." He was right about January. I have never been so cold in my life as I was that winter. The propane ran low and I rationed it, heating one room and closing off the rest of the house, sleeping in my father's bed under every quilt I could find because it was the warmest room and because, I'll admit, it still smelled faintly of him, and that was a comfort I wouldn't confess to anyone. The pipes froze twice. The truck wouldn't start for most of February, so I walked the 4 miles down to the store when I needed anything, and there were stretches when I needed things I couldn't afford and simply went without. I lost weight that winter I didn't have to lose. I catch sight of myself in the spotted mirror in the hall, this gaunt, hollow-eyed woman, in a dead man's coat, and not entirely recognize her. There was one night, deep in January, the coldest of the whole winter, when I came as close to breaking as I ever came. The fire had gone out while I slept, and I woke in the black hours with the cold like a hand on my chest. And I lay there in my father's bed, and I thought, with a calm that frightened me more than panic would have, I cannot do this. I am going to call Coy Ribel in the morning and take whatever he offers and let the farm go to the church the way the will says and just be done. Be warm. Be done. I got up, and I built the fire back with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and while I was kneeling there feeding kindling to coals, banking the way my father had taught me 40 years before, low and slow. That's the whole secret of everything worth doing. I heard the sow down in the lower lot. Ada! She'd heard me moving, and she was at the fence in the dark and the cold, waiting. Because to her, I was the one who came when called, the one thing in her world that was reliable. And I knelt there by the fire, and I cried, not the clean, cleansing kind, but the ugly, exhausted kind. And then I got up, and I pulled on my boots, and I went down in the dark and the cold to feed a hog that didn't know it had just kept a person alive. You cannot leave a thing that depends on you. My father knew that. The whole brutal architecture of the year was built on it. I didn't call rival. And somewhere in those frozen months, a thing happened to me that I can only describe as my father's bet paying off. The land held me up. The work gave my hand something to do while my heart did its slow, ugly business of healing. I started sleeping through the night. I started once or twice to laugh. By February, I'd stopped thinking of the farm as my father's and started thinking of it as mine. And the difference between those two things turned out to be everything. Ribel came back twice. The second time the number was lower, like he'd promised, and he spent 20 minutes on my porch explaining with great patience and false sorrow why a woman in my position would be foolish to let pride cost her a roof over her head. I let him talk. I'd learned that from my father, the power of simply not filling a silence, and it unsettled Ribel more than any argument could have. A man like that needs you to push back so he can push harder. When you give him nothing to push against, the smoothness starts to crack, and you see what's underneath. The third time, he didn't bother with a check at all. He came in May, when the dogwood were out, and he stood at the bottom of my porch steps and dropped the act entirely. He said a single woman alone up a hollow ought to think hard about her safety. He said accidents happen on these old farms, that the wire in a house this old was a hazard, that a fire in a dry summer could take everything before the volunteer department got up the road. And wouldn't it be a shame, after I'd suffered through the winter, to lose it all to a spark? He said it the way such men say such things, with a smile, so that if I repeated it to anyone it would sound like concern. But we both knew what it was. He'd shown me, finally, the thing underneath the smoothness, and the thing underneath was a man who would burn a woman out of her home for a piece of ground he wanted. I listened to all of it standing in my doorway with my father's shotgun broke open over my arm, not pointed at anything, just present, the way the old Smokehouse was present. And when he was done, I said one thing. I said, "You've been very careful all these months never to mention the Smokehouse. Every offer, every threat. And you never once asked about the one thing on this place the whole county wonders about. A man doesn't tiptoe around a thing he doesn't want." The smile went off his face like a light switched off, and I knew I'd been right all along. And so, did he? And he saw that I knew. I told him to get off my land and not come back. He didn't. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. But his words stayed with me, the way ugly words do. A fire could take everything. And I started to wonder, lying awake those last warm nights of spring, what everything meant. What was up there in the cedars that a man like Coy Ribel would threaten a woman over? What my father had spent 31 years protecting behind a brass lock gone green. The year was up on the 11th of March. I'd marked on the calendar that hung in the kitchen, the same kind of feed store calendar my father had hung in that same spot every year of my childhood. I'd crossed off the days like a prisoner, except somewhere along the way it had stopped feeling like a sentence. The night before, I couldn't find the key. My father's letter had said the key is where you'll think to look once you've been here long enough to remember who you are. I'd torn the house apart looking for it, on and off, for months. I'd checked every drawer, every coffee can, every pocket of every coat. I'd checked the obvious places, and then the clever places, and then the places so obvious I'd skipped them the first time. Nothing. And now it was the night before the year turned, and I sat at the kitchen table with my father's reading glasses still marking that page in Ecclesiastes. And I was nearly out of my mind with wanting to know. Remember who you are. I picked up the Bible. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the one thing in the house I hadn't disturbed. The one thing that still sat exactly where he left it. The glasses slid off as I lifted it, and the book fell open to the page he'd marked, and there in the gutter of the binding, taped flat to the page with a strip of cloth tape gone yellow, was a key. Brass. Small. The kind that fits an old padlock. The page was the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes. He'd underlined one line in pencil, pressed so hard the lead had nearly torn the paper. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to keep, the verse went on, and a time to cast away. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I climbed the hill to the cedars with the key in my fist, and my heart going like a hammer. The padlock fought me. 31 years of weather had nearly fused it, and I had to work the key back and forth, breathing on it, until something gave deep inside the mechanism, and the shackle popped free with a sound like a small bone breaking. I lifted the hasp. I pulled the door, and it dragged on its hinges, swollen with age, and then it swung wide, and the morning light went ahead of me into a room that no living person but my father had entered in 3 decades. For a moment, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The smokehouse was full. From the blackened chestnut rafters, on iron hooks my great-grandfather must have forged, hung row upon row of cured hams. Dozens of them, each one wrapped in cloth and then in paper. Each one tagged with a wooden tag, and on each tag, in 3 different hands across 3 generations, a date. I walked down the rows in the half-dark, reading. The newest were in my father's cramped print. The middle ones in a looser, older hand I didn't know, my grandfather's. And the oldest at the very back, on tags so dark with smoke they were almost unreadable, in a hand that must have been my great-grandfather's, a man dead 50 years before I was born. The oldest date was 1931. I stood in that doorway, and I did not understand. And then slowly, terribly, I began to. These were not for eating. A ham cures for a year, 2 at the outside. These had hung for decades. My father, his father, his father's father, 3 generations of Mercermen had each hung hams in this house and never sold them, never ate them, just let them hang in the cold smoke in the cedar dark, year after year after year, adding to a thing none of them would live to finish. I didn't understand why. Not yet. I only understood that I was looking at something my whole family had built across nearly 100 years, in secret, with no explanation, on faith. And then I saw the box. It sat on a shelf of river stone at the very back, beneath the oldest hams, a strong box of black iron with second lock, and resting on top of it, weighted down by a smooth river rock, an oilcloth packet. I lifted the rock. Inside the oilcloth was a ledger, leather-bound, swollen and soft with age, and a letter in my father's hand. Newer than the rest, the ink barely faded. I sat down on the cold stone floor of that smokehouse, surrounded by 100 years of hanging hams, and I read it. Della, it said, by now you have opened the door, and you are confused and maybe a little frightened. And that is right. That is exactly how I felt when my own father brought me up here the spring after he died, and I read the letter his father left him. So let me tell you what I know, the same as it was told to me. In the winter of 1931, my grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, Elias Mercer, was a young man with a wife and a baby, and not one thin dime, the same as half the country in those days. The bank in Hyden had failed and taken with it every dollar the family had managed to save, which was not much, but it was everything. Elias swore an oath that winter that he would never again put his family's safety in a thing he could not hold in his own 2 hands and protect with his own life. He did not trust banks. He did not trust paper money, which he had watched turn worthless. He trusted 3 things: the land, his own labor, and the one thing this family has always known how to make better than anyone, which is cured meat that does not spoil and only grows more valuable with age, like wine, like timber, like trust itself. So he began to set aside, not money. He had no faith in money. He cured the finest hams the family produced each year, and he did not sell them, and he did not eat them. He hung them here, in the house his own father had built, and he let them age, and he kept a ledger of what each one was worth and what it would be worth, and he made his son swear add to it and never draw it down except in the family's hour of greatest need. His son, my father, did the same, and so did I. I sat there in the cold reading my father's letter, and the ledger lay heavy in my lap, and I opened it, and I began to understand what I was holding. The ledger was 3 ledgers, really, bound into one over the years. the cheap pasteboard covers of the older two stitched inside the leather of my father's. The first pages were brittle as autumn leaves, and the ink had gone the brown of old blood. Elias's hand was a careful copybook script, the hand of a man who'd had little schooling, and was proud of what letters he'd managed to keep. The first entry was dated the 9th of January, 1931, and it was not about hams at all. It was an accounting of what the bank failure had taken. He'd written it all out, every dollar, the way you'd write out the details of death, and at the bottom he'd put a line I read 4 times. They took the money, but they cannot take the knowing of how to make a thing. From this day I bank in meat. After that, the entries became what they would be for 90 years. A date, a description of the ham, the weight green and the weight after the first year's loss, the wood used, the weather that season, and a value. Elias had been shrewder than his lack of schooling would suggest. He understood something about scarcity that the bankers who ruined him never grasped, which is that a thing which takes decades to make and cannot be hurried becomes, with each passing year, not older but rarer, and rarity is the one kind of wealth that compounds without a bank to hold it. He wrote estimates beside each ham and revised them upward as the years passed, and where I could follow his figuring it was sound. A ham aged 5 years was worth a month of a working man's wages. A ham aged 20 was worth a season. The handful aged past 50, he simply marked with a question mark, and the words asked the right buyer, because there was no precedent. Because nobody on earth did what the Mercers were quietly doing a lockstone building up a Kentucky hollow. I turned the pages forward through the decades and watched the hands change. Elias gave way to a looser, rounder script. My grandfather, whose name I learned from the ledger was Boone Mercer, dead before I was born, who'd kept the oath through the war years and a fire that nearly took the barn in 1958 and a stretch in the 60s when the entries hinted. The family had gone hungry enough that the temptation to draw the hams down must have been terrible. But Boone hadn't. There was an entry from the spring of 1963. Just 4 words, hard winter, held fast, and something about those 4 words sat in my chest like a stone. They had been hungry, my grandfather and his family, hungry in a way I'd only flirted with that winter. And there had been $100,000 in cured meat hanging 40 feet up the hill, and he had held fast, because the oath said the hams came down only in the hour of greatest need, and a hard winter was not, to Boone Mercer, need enough. Then my father's hand, which I knew, cramped and careful, the schoolboy shame of it never quite worn off. His entries ran from the year he took over until 3 weeks before he died. And reading them, I understood for the first time the shape of my father's whole secret life, the life that had run alongside the one I'd seen as a child and known nothing about. Every November, after the killing and the working hams were hung in the lower house to sell, he'd climbed the hill in the cedars and hung one more, the best one, for the hoard, and written it in the book. There were 40-some entries in his hand, 40-some years, and against a number of them, in the margin, he'd written initials, mine, DM. He'd marked certain hams as mine, hung specifically against the day I'd come home, and the dates of those went all the way back to the year I left, and forward through every silent year between us. The years I didn't write, the years I told people I was an only child of dead parents, because it was simply in explaining a father I was ashamed of being ashamed of. He had pages of correspondence tucked into the back. 2, folded letters going back decades, addresses and names, a quiet network of people who understood what age ham was, restaurant in Charleston and Atlanta, a chef in New York who'd written my father 3 times trying to buy a single 50-year ham, and been turned down 3 times. A food historian at a university who'd heard a rumor of the Mercer Smokehouse and written confirm it existed and gotten no reply at all. My father had read the world's interest in the thing he was making and had simply declined to sell, year after year, decade after decade, because the ledger said in his hand against one of the New York entries, "It is not yet our hour of greatest need, and a thing sold before its time is wasted same as a thing given, a great age country ham." I came to understand from his notes and historian's letters, is one of the rarest foods in the world. He had pages on it. There were hams in this house that had hung for 40, 50, 60 years. There were a handful at the very back, the 1931 hams, Elias's first, that hung for 90 years. And against those entries my father had written a figure, an estimate of their worth, and beside it he had written in pencil. I do not know if this is even possible to sell, but a museum offered this for one in 2009, and I turned them down because it was not yet our hour of greatest need. The figure was larger than the check Coy Ribble had laid on my porch rail, much larger, and that was for one ham. There were 90-some in the house, but that was not the part that made me weep. The part that made me weep was further down in my father's letter, the part where he stopped talking about money. Della, he wrote, I know what you are thinking now, looking at all this. You are thinking your father was a fool to keep you cold and hungry for a year when this was up here the whole time. You are thinking I should have sold one ham and saved us both so much grief. And maybe you are right, but I want you to understand what this place really is, because it is not a bank, and it never was, no matter what my grandfather believed. Every man in this family who hung a ham in this house was making a promise to a person he would never meet. Elias hung his ham for a grandson he didn't have yet. My father hung his for me before I was old enough to walk. I hung mine every year of your life, for you, even in the years you were gone and angry and would not answer my letters. I would come up here in the cold and hang a ham and think, this one is for Della, for the day she comes home and needs it. I never knew if you would come. I hung them anyway. That is what faith is, I have come to think. It is hanging a ham for someone who may never come home, and trusting that if they do, it will be here. The hour of greatest need that Elias wrote about. Della, I think he had it wrong, or I think I came to understand it different than he did. The greatest need this family ever had was not for money. We were poor 100 years, and it did not break us. The greatest need was for a reason come home, and a thing waiting here when we did. That is what I have left you, not the money, though God knows you may need it, and you should take it. Sell what you must. I free you from the oath. The season of keeping is over, and the season of casting away has come. But before you sell a single one, I want you to walk down the rows and read the dates and understand that you were never alone up here, not for one cold night this whole year. 3 generations of men who loved you before you were born were keeping you company in the dark. I do not have the words to tell you what it was to read that, sitting on the floor of that smokehouse in the gray March light, with the hams hanging over me like a congregation. I had spent a year believing my father's last act was a cruelty. And it was not cruelty at all. It was the deepest kindness a hard man knew how to give, dressed up in the only language he had, which was work and patience and the long faith of the mountains. He had not made me suffer through the year to torment me. He had made me stay long enough to become the kind of person who could understand what I was looking at. A thing given before its time is wasted. His first letter had said, if he had handed me 90 hams and a ledger worth more than the farm on the day, I drove up broken. I have sold a lot to Coy Ribble inside a week and never understood that I'd sold my own family's 100-year heart for the price of a fresh start. I wept until I was empty. Then I wiped my face on my sleeve and I stood up and I walked the rows one more time, reading every date, every hand, all the way back to Elias in 1931. And when I got to the end, I said, out loud, to the cold smoke and the cedar dark and the men who'd kept me company without my knowing, I'm home. I came home. Thank you for waiting. I took the ledger down to the house, and I sat with it for a week before I did anything. There was a temptation, and I'll be honest about it, to sell it all at once, to call every name in that ledger, sell the whole 100-year hoard, take the money and finally be safe in the way I'd want to be safe my whole life. Coy Ribble's number multiplied by 90 would have made me wealthy past anything I'd ever imagined. I could have walked away from those mountains forever with more money than the restaurant ever dreamed of clearing. But I'd read my father's letter, and I understood now what he understood. The hams weren't the wealth. The hams were just the visible part. The wealth was the thing the hams were made of, which was 100 years of skill, of patience, of a family doing one thing better than anyone alive and refusing to let it die. If I sold it all at once, I'd have money, but the smokehouse would be empty, and the chain that ran back to 1931 would be broken on my watch. And the next time a Mercer came home broken, there'd be nothing in the cedars but dust. So this is what I did, and it's what I'm still doing. I sold 5 of the hams. The 5 oldest, the 1931 hams. Elias's first, the ones my father said a museum had wanted. But I didn't just write a letter and ship them off in a crate. I'd read enough of the ledger by then to understand that the worth of those hams was not only in the meat, it was in the proof the documentation, the unbroken chain of dates and hands going back 90 years. And a thing like that you do not sell sight unseen to the highest bidder. So I wrote to the food historian whose letters my father had never answered, a woman named Dr. Sarah Vance at the University in Lexington, and I told her the Mercer Smokehouse was real, that I was Walt Mercer's daughter, and that if she still cared to see it, the door was unlocked now. She drove 4 hours up into the mountains the following week, and she got lost twice on roads that don't show up on any map. And when she finally came up Cutshin Road, in a little car never meant for it, she was out before the engine stopped. I walked her up the hill to the cedars. I opened the door, and I watched a woman who had spent her whole professional life studying the foodways of these mountains walk into that stone building, look up at 90 years of hanging hams, read the oldest tag, and put her hand over her mouth. She sat down on the cold floor exactly the way I had, and for a different reason, but I have come to think a related one. After a while she said, very quietly, "Do you understand what this is?" And I said I was beginning to. She said there may be a handful of continuously documented family curing operations left in the entire region, and not one of them, not one, reaches back unbroken to the Depression with a written record kept the whole way. She used the word irreplaceable. She used it more than once. She said the academic word for it was a living archive, and then she stopped using academic words and just sat there on the floor and looked up at the work of 4 generations of my family and cried. And I sat down beside her, and we cried together, 2 women who'd come to the same place by different roads. Dr. Vance was the one who found the buyers in the end and made sure it was done right. The museum took 2 of the 1931 hams for a permanent exhibit on Appalachian self-sufficiency, with the family's name on it, and a copy of Elias's first ledger page under glass, the page that said, "From this day, I bank in meat." A restaurant in Charleston, one of the names from my father's correspondence, took the other 3, and the chef there, a serious young man who'd grown up 2 hollows over before the world took him elsewhere, drove up himself to collect them and would not let me crate them in the truck bed, carried in the cab like passengers. He'd known my father by reputation. He stood in the smokehouse a long time before he left. He said, "In the city, they think this kind of thing is gone. They think nobody does it anymore." He looked at me. Don't let them be right. The 5 hams brought enough to pay off everything I owed in the world and to fix the roof of the house, and to buy a freezer and lumber and a good breeding pair of hogs, and to put a real fence around the lower lot. Enough to make me safe. Not rich. Safe, which it turned out was all I'd ever actually needed. And the difference between those 2 things was a whole lesson my father had spent his death teaching me. And then I started curing. That first fall I hung 4 hams in the old smokehouse, on the empty hooks where Elias's 1931 hams had been. I tagged them in my own hand, the 4th hand now in that house, and I dated them, and I wrote in the ledger, beneath my father's last entry, the first entry of my own. I'm not curing them to sell. Some of them, the working hams, I'll sell, and the food historian has helped me set up so that the curing supports the farm and the farm supports me. And for the first time in my adult life, I am not afraid of January. But the hams on Elias's hooks, those I'm hanging the old way, for the long aging, for the decades. I'm hanging them for someone I'll never meet. I don't have children. I may not ever. But there will be a Mercer someday, a niece's child or a cousin's grandchild, or someone whose blood I share, and whose name I'll never know, who comes up Cutshin Road broke and broken with nowhere left to fall. And when they do, the door on the hill will be locked, and there will be a key taped in the Bible, and there will be hams in the cedar dark that someone hung for them before they were born. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.